(6:30).
Good evening, everyone. I am calling the Monday, June 1st, 2020 Parks and Natural Resources Commission meeting to order at 6:30 p.m. As you know, government agencies and organizations around our country are being asked to take extraordinary measures to prevent the spread of COVID-19. The city of Burnsville is committed to protecting the health of our residents and public officials. Current recommendations call for everyone to practice social distancing as much as possible. So that means tonight's Parks and Natural Resource Commission meeting will be held virtually using Zoom. As the chair, I will be leading the commission meeting, and the public is welcome to participate when invited throughout the meeting. Additional instructions on how to participate are posted online at burnsvillemn.gov in the public meeting calendar. As usual, tonight's meeting is also available for viewing on BCTV and on the city's website. If you are unable to participate this evening and would like to submit public testimony, I encourage you to send in your comments to city staff. JJ Ryan is our representative, and his email is jj.ryan, R-Y-A-N, at burnsvillemn.gov, or mail your comments via postal mail to 100 Civic Center Parkway in Burnsville, Minnesota, 55337. You may also participate in the meeting tonight online by going to zoom.us/join and typing in meeting ID 961-878-03049. That ID number is also on the screen in front of you. Once you are logged into the meeting, please use the chat feature to tell the moderator which item you would wish to speak to. And you can also call into the meeting at 651-372-8299. For the public hearing, I will open up a time when callers may speak to that item, and we'll give more instructions at that point. Your call will be muted until that time. So now that we're done with all of those additional details, which are unique because we're in a virtual setting, we're going to move on to the normal kind of flow of the agenda. So with that, we're going to move on to the adoption of the agenda. Would anybody like to motion? Gary, I'm seeing you as a first.
I so move.
All right. Do I have a second?
I second.
Thanks, Dina. JJ, do you mind calling the roll of votes?
Commissioner Angara.
Aye.
Commissioner Arnold.
Aye.
Commissioner Bauer.
Aye.
Commissioner Cleveland.
Aye.
Commissioner Donaldson.
Aye.
Commissioner Fitchett.
Aye.
Commissioner McGuire. Commissioner Newman.
Aye.
And Commissioner Woolman.
Aye.
Thank you. The motion passes.
Thank you, JJ. Our second item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from January 6, 2020, last time we were able to be together in person. Has anyone reviewed the comments they would like to approve?
I make a motion to approve the minutes.
Thanks, Commissioner Arnold. A second?
Second.
All right, thank you. And with that, JJ, do you want to call the roll of votes again?
Yes, again, Commissioner Angara.
Aye.
Commissioner Arnold.
Aye.
Commissioner Bauer.
Aye.
Commissioner Cleveland.
Aye.
Commissioner Donaldson.
Aye.
Commissioner Fitchett.
Aye.
Commissioner McGuire.
Aye.
Commissioner Newman.
Aye.
Commissioner Woolman. And again, the motion passes.
Thank you. With that, our third item on the agenda is citizen comments. Megan, are there anybody that wishes to comment on the line?
There is no one who has requested to comment.
Thank you, Megan. All right, and with that, I believe we have a guest. We have Caleb to talk about the 2019 and 2020 deer report and proposed strategies for 2021.
All right. Thank you, Chair Newman. Thank you, commissioners, for having me. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. So my name is Caleb Ashling. I'm a natural resources specialist for the city of Burnsville, and I'm here to give our annual report on deer management. Next slide, please. So I know some commissioners are familiar with the program, but for those who aren't, the Natural Resources Master Plan in 1999 recommended that the city initiate a deer management program. There was a deer management plan put together, which was adopted by City Council in 2001. And among other things, that set a population density goal for deer within the city. Next slide. So the program is intended to address a few different issues related to a high deer population in a suburban area like Burnsville. One is increased deer car collisions and the related human health or economic concerns with that. Another issue is the negative impacts that deer can have on natural areas when there's a high deer population and they're browsing or over browsing in our parks. Then landscaping depredation or deer damaging residential landscaping is also an issue at high deer populations. And then disease risk in the deer population at high densities, where you're more likely to get disease spread with an overpopulation. Next slide. So what I'll be doing today is reporting on the 2019-2020 program year, and then making some recommendations for the 2020-2021 program year. And just so you know, the program years they don't run the calendar year. They run from April 1st of one year to March 31st of the following year. Next slide. So I'll be covering the program over a couple different categories. The first is education, related to educating the Burnsville residents on deer issues. The second is the feeding ban related information. The next is our monitoring programs. And then the last is the population control portion of the program. So for education, we try to get the word out to residents, especially related to our deer feeding ban, through a couple different ways. So we have we have information on our website that covers issues related to deer feeding and our management activities. We also try to get information into the Burnsville Bulletin regularly that discusses the deer feeding ban. And then we also use social media as an outreach tool to get the word out. And if you're not familiar, it is against city ordinance to feed deer or otherwise, even unintentionally, putting food on the ground that deer can access. So you can have bird feeders, that's okay, but bird feeders need to be at least 5 feet off the ground. Next slide. So in this past program year, we had 2 feeding violations that were reported to the city. And in those instances, city staff follow up on the reports. And if necessary, we'll send a warning letter to the residents, just letting them know that it's against the ordinance. And then we'll conduct a follow-up visit in a week or two, just to make sure the feeders have been removed, and that's almost always enough to take care of the issue. So we recommend just continuing monitoring and these action letters as needed. All right, so moving on to the monitoring portion of our deer management program. That breaks down into 3 different areas. Our aerial counts to monitor the population, our monitoring forums for residents to submit issues, and then our tracking of car deer collisions in the city. So for our monitoring and for population management, we look at the city not as a whole, but we break it into 6 different zones. So these are the 6 zones that we use: the northeast, northwest, west central, east central, southwest, and southeast zones. So you'll see those mentioned in the next few slides. So every year, if conditions warrant, we have a deer survey conducted by helicopter. We've been working with the Three Rivers Park District to have those surveys conducted by their staff the past few years. They fly deer surveys for a number of different cities in the metro area, including Bloomington across the river. And they also fly surveys in their own parks, like Murphy-Hanrahan, part of which is in Burnsville. So it works well to coordinate with them to have them also fly a survey in Burnsville. And the surveys focus on deer habitat in the city, and this photo here is taken from a helicopter. So as you can see, deer are relatively visible, especially if there's good conditions when you're conducting the survey. So our aerial survey that was conducted this past winter counted 221 deer total throughout the city. If you look at that by management zone, the most deer were counted in southwest Burnsville. The second most deer were counted in northeast Burnsville. And that is pretty typical. In southwest Burnsville, we have Murphy-Hanrahan Park, partially in the city and also adjacent, which is a really large natural area. And then there's also a lot of large wooded lots in that area. Then in northeast Burnsville, we have the wildlife refuge and a natural corridor along the river that has a lot of deer habitat as well. So those were the 2 highest areas, but in general, we found decent numbers of deer in the other zones except the west central zone. So on to the citizen submitted monitoring reports. So we do have a website, a section of our website where residents can submit either observations or landscaping issue reports that they're having with deer. And then we also take these reports by phone call or email directly. So we had, in this past program year, we had 1 just general observation in the southeast zone. And then we had 6 depredation reports, and 5 of those were in the east central management zone, especially kind of between City Hall and Terrace Oaks Park. There's a decent-sized deer herd that was causing some landscaping issues in that area. And then 1 report from southeast Burnsville. All right, then the other component of the monitoring program is tracking deer car collisions. And the way we do that is to combine a couple different data sources. The first is our police records. So we query the database for police records and track those that come up with a deer car issue. Then we also get a report from our animal control contractor. So they track where they pick up deer carcasses along the roadways. And we get that report. We combine it with the police records. We remove any overlaps of the same instance reported between the 2. And we use that for this our mapping and yearly tracking. So this past program year, there were 55 total car crashes in town, or minimum 55 based on our tracking. The largest number of those were in east central Burnsville. So that's Terrace Oaks Park. There were 17 in that area, or Terrace Oaks Park and kind of the surrounding area. And then the second largest was in southwest Burnsville, where there were 14. and followed by southeast Burnsville. So although the East Central and Southeast Burnsville don't necessarily have the most deer in town, when you do have decent numbers of deer in residential areas, that can lead to more vehicle collisions. And 55 deer was around what we had, or 55 crashes was around what we had last year as well. So we recommend just continuing with our annual monitoring methods to track the deer population. All right, then on to the population control portion of the program. So when needed, we do conduct population control for the deer population, and we use two different strategies. The first is archery hunting, and the second is sharpshooting. So for our archery program, we encourage archery hunting on private property where possible. You are allowed to archery hunt according to city ordinance, but you have to have a decent size lot to do so. So there is, or the main area where people archery hunt in Burnsville is in southwest Burnsville, where there's some larger lots. And then we do operate archery hunts on public land where possible. We work with the Metro Bow Hunters Resource Base, which is a nonprofit organization that helps cities conduct kind of more close quarters suburban archery hunts. And the location where we've been holding a hunt the past few years is Keller Lake Park. So through our public archery hunt, we harvested 11 deer at Keller Lake Park, which is fairly typical for the harvest in that area. And then the Three Rivers Park District also hosts their own archery hunt, which the city isn't involved in, but they did harvest 37 deer in their hunt at Murphy-Hanrahan Park. And for our tracking purposes, because Murphy-Hanrahan is approximately 10% in Burnsville, we consider about 10% of their harvest in our tracking. So about 4 deer were counted towards our totals from their hunt. And then portions of Burnsville don't really allow for public archery hunts because the parks are not really big enough or too busy for that. So when needed, we do conduct sharpshooting utilizing the Burnsville Police Department. And we conducted sharpshooting this past program year in the Northeast, East Central, and Southeast units. And there were 20 deer harvested through that effort. And through the archery hunting program, we do donate, process the deer and donate the venison to local food shelves. So there was over 900 pounds of venison donated through this program, this past program year. So this table here looks at the removal goals that were laid out in last year's plan, and then compares them to the actual removals that occurred. And the goals are based on 15 to 25 deer per square mile of preferred habitat. So that's kind of our density goal that we're working off of. In the Northwest zone, we don't have any accessible property at this time, so no work was done there. In the West Central zone, there was a low removal goal, so we didn't focus on that area this past year. In Southwest Burnsville, we harvested 15 deer, which was in the range of the goals, and those were harvested through archery. The Northeast zone, we harvested 7 deer, which was in the range of the goals there through sharpshooting. Then in East Central and Southeast, we harvested 5 and 8 deer respectively. Those areas are a little bit trickier. It is a challenge, sharpshooting. There's not always as many sites as we'd like to. We have to make sure we have sites that are safe So that's kind of our top priority. And so that can be a limiting factor in the number of areas where we're able to conduct sharpshooting. So sometimes that limits the number of deer harvested in some of the areas. But total, there were 35 deer harvested through sharpshooting and archery, which was close to the lower end of the goal that we were targeting. Then the next slide here looks at the recommended harvest for the upcoming program year. And this slide is a little bit messy, but the population goal column shows the actual number of deer that the program would like to see in the different zones. The projected fall population column takes the survey that was conducted this past winter, factors in fawn birth and some natural mortality using a method similar to what the DNR uses, and to give us a projected population for this upcoming fall. And then we use that projection to set out our recommended harvest for the upcoming program year. So the harvest column is on the right here. The areas that we'll intend to focus on are the southwest zone. There's a minimum harvest goal of 49 deer there. The northeast zone, minimum of 32 in that zone. East central, 6, and southeast, 24 deer in that area. That does give us a minimum harvest goal of 111 deer, which is probably more deer than we'll be able to harvest based on the limited sites that we have. So we're not necessarily going to be getting to that number, but we can certainly do our best to try to get the deer population closer to that goal range that we're looking for. So our recommendations are to continue with the Keller Park archery hunt in the southwest unit. And we have 3 proposed hunt periods for that hunt. Those hunt periods are September 17th through the 19th, October 15th through the 17th, and November 19th through the 21st. And the park is essentially closed to the public during those dates. And then the Three Rivers Park District also plans on conducting archery hunts in Murphy-Hanrahan Park because those are, part of the park is in Burnsville. Those hunts also need a recommendation for city council approval. The dates for those hunts are the October 16th through the 18th and November 20th through the 22nd. Then I did want to mention one new development in deer related issues in Dakota County. So this past winter or early spring, the DNR did find one deer that had chronic wasting disease. Chronic wasting disease is a neurological disease similar to mad cow disease that affects deer, elk, and moose. And it had not previously been seen or found in Dakota County. So this is a new area for CWD. And this is going to initiate some action steps for the DNR from their chronic wasting disease protocol for when a new spot is discovered. So some of those action items that the DNR will likely initiate. Last I heard, these were still proposed, so I'm not sure if they're finalized yet. But there will likely be a Dakota County feeding ban, which we're positioned well for that because we already have a feeding ban in Burnsville, but not all cities in Dakota County have that. Then there will be mandatory testing for chronic wasting disease, both for archery hunted deer in Burnsville and also for deer harvested through our program. Then there will be carcass movement restrictions for harvested deer. So deer will have to remain in the zone unless they're processed and quartered before leaving the zone. So deer will have to remain within the zone after they're harvested until a negative test is received back. And then the DNR would continue these action items for 3 years until, well, hopefully at that point, if no further tests came back positive, they would stop the testing. If there were more positives, then there could potentially be an extension of this testing period. And with that, so first I'd like to request that the commissioners consider those archery hunt dates and recommend them for city council approval. And then I'd also be happy to stand for any questions.
So with that, commissioners, do we have any questions for Caleb first? Gary, do you have a question? You may be on mute, Gary.
No, I don't.
Okay. Commissioner Cleveland, do you have a question for Caleb?
Yeah, I'm guessing that if the CWD testing comes in, you'd have a fairly easy way of tracking all deer. Because you've got a few at Murphy, and they would probably all be tested. And I'm guessing the same thing holds true for the archery work at Keller, and then the sharpshooting. So it doesn't sound like that's going to be a big burden for the city. Would that be your take on it?
Yeah, it definitely, it's very doable to take testing. You know, it creates some issues with the getting the deer processed because the processor we had been using is outside of the zone that will likely be established. So we'll have to figure out, you know, some new setups, you know, probably a new processor and some new steps like that. But it all seems very doable to do. It'll just be maybe some new figuring out of how we make that portion of it work.
And just as a follow-up, did you get any data from Department of Transportation in the 35W corridor or the Highway 13 corridor for deer kills by vehicle collision?
So we did not. The state of Minnesota hasn't been able to provide us with transportation records the past few years. They transitioned to a new database, and we haven't been able to get all those records yet. But hopefully down the road, we will be able to. In past years, when we did have that data, it was usually only a couple of deer, so it didn't add a lot to our totals.
Caleb, I have a question myself. I noticed on when they're talking about the crash data, it says in 2019 there was a minimum number at 55, but then later it says 43 crashes reported by the city police. So are some of those not necessarily reported by the city police? They're reported instead by the people that are looking to pick up the carcasses. Is that what I understand?
Yes. Yep. So 43 were, from the database, the police record database. Then sometimes people may not report a deer collision for insurance purposes or whatever. And so the other deer reports were from that animal control contractor that the city uses.
Excellent. Any other questions from anybody in the commission right now? With that, Caleb is looking for a motion to recommend the dates to City Council. So I'm looking for somebody to motion.
I motion that we approve the proposal.
Thank you, Commissioner Cleveland. Is there a second?
Second.
All right. Thank you. With that, JJ, can we call the roll of votes?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner Angara,
Aye.
Commissioner Arnold,
Aye.
Commissioner Bauer,
Aye.
Commissioner Cleveland,
Aye.
Commissioner Donaldson,
Aye.
Commissioner Fitchett,
Aye.
Commissioner McGuire. Commissioner Newman,
Aye.
Commissioner Woolman.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion passes.
All right, thank you, Caleb. And I believe you have the next item on our agenda of the review of water quality conditions in Burnsville Lakes relative to city goals and state of Minnesota standards. Is that right?
Yep, that is correct.
All right, thank you, Caleb.
All right. This is kind of our annual update on where we are at with water quality and some of our priority water bodies in town here. This is intended as an informational update, so there's no action item needed. So just a quick review of kind of how the watersheds work here in Burnsville. Burnsville is a part of 3 major watersheds. The first is the Credit River watershed. So in southwest Burnsville, especially around Keller Park, that area drains to the Credit River. We're also a part of the Vermilion River watershed, and that's a relatively small area around Lake Alum. So that will drain east over to the Vermilion River. And the major watershed that we're a part of is the Minnesota River watershed. So all of the areas in tan on this map drain to the Minnesota River. And the arrows on the map indicate kind of the connection or direction of flow through our storm sewer system and through our lakes towards the river. So in the upper part of the watershed, you have LaVon and Keller Lake. And then it follows the arrows through Twin, Early, over to Sunset Pond, down through Kramer Nature Preserve, down to the river. So that's kind of the process or flow of water around Burnsville. So we have, so the water flows through a pretty impressive system of storm sewer pipes. So there are approximately 185 miles of storm sewer pipes in Burnsville. There's 6,500 storm drains that feeds those storm sewer pipes. And the storm sewer system runs through our ponds, lakes, wetlands, and onto the river. And we have nearly 300 ponds and lakes. And the majority of those are a part or receive stormwater runoff and are kind of part of our water management system. So this system does a great job of helping us get water off the landscape and prevent flooding and property damage. But it does also, transport, pollution potentially from streets and lawns into our lakes and ponds as well. All right, so I'm gonna talk about the city's or track our water quality progress through a couple different standards. The first is the city's standards or goals that we set out in our water resources management plan. So the city has its own goals for clarity, all of which are more strict or stringent than the state standards, which I'll cover next. So this table here shows clarity goal in meters. Clarity is measured by volunteers who are part of a program that goes out every other week from April through October. And they lower the Secchi disc, that's the black and white disc on the right side of the slide here. They lower that into the water, and when they can no longer see it, they mark that depth. And we track that as the clarity reading for that visit. And then we average all the visits throughout the season, and that becomes kind of our average for the season. So I won't go over every lake here, but I will highlight the best lake for water clarity in Burnsville is Lac LaVon. Lac LaVon has a goal of 3.6 meters and has a 3-year average of what we've been actually seeing of 4.3 meters. So that's really, really good clarity for a metro area lake. So that's good to see. And then we have 4 other water bodies that are meeting the city water resources plan clarity goal. And then we have 3 water bodies that are not meeting the goal. Those are the Alum Lake, Keller Lake, and then Wood Pond, which I'll hit on in future slides here. So then the other way, or the next way, we'll be looking at some of our lakes and their water quality is through the state water quality standards. And the primary one that we look at is the standards for nutrients, which includes phosphorus, chlorophyll A, which is an indicator of algae, and then clarity, which also generally indicates algae. And the state has different standards for shallow lakes versus deep lakes. Shallow lakes are naturally a little more nutrient rich, so the standards are less strict for shallow, more strict for deeper lakes. And the state does have an impaired waters list. A lake or water body gets on the impaired waters list if it fails to meet 2 or more of these standards over a 10-year period. Burnsville does have 2 impaired waters. The first is Alum Lake, and the second is Keller Lake. And what it means to have an impaired water is that it's not meeting those state standards over the 10-year period. Then studies are conducted to determine what's going on in the lake, where the excessive nutrients are coming from. A plan is developed amongst the agencies that manage land in the watershed, and reduction goals for nutrient inflow is divvied up amongst those agencies. And then the agencies go about installing projects that will reduce the amount of nutrient inflow to the lake. So that's kind of what it means to have an impaired waters. It is kind of a long process. But Burnsville does have 2 lakes that have been removed from the impaired waters list. Most recently, Crystal Lake was removed from the impaired waters list in 2018, which means conditions had improved significantly enough over a 10-year period to now meet those standards, which is great. And then Early Lake was also removed in 2012. So great to see. There's a lot of metro area lakes on the impaired waters list. Not a lot of them are coming off. So nice to have a few that have come off in Burnsville. So the remaining slides here, we'll kind of hit on each lake and compare them to the relevant state standards. So Lake Alum Lake is one of our impaired waters. It's a very shallow lake, max depth of, I believe, 8 feet, but mostly a lot shallower than that. And it's a pretty nutrient-rich system. So in 2019, it did not meet the phosphorus and chlorophyll standards. It did have a good year, met the clarity goals or standards for a 1-year period. And we did have some recent watershed projects, an alum treatment in adjacent storm ponds, and some other projects that reduced nutrient inflow. And we're hopeful that some of those clarity improvements were related to the work that we've been doing in the watershed, and hopefully we'll continue to see those. Lac LaVon is the next lake here. As you can see, the clarity goal for a deep lake like Lac LaVon would be 1.4 meters, and Lac LaVon has a clarity goal of 4.2. So well above what the standards are for the state. Lac LaVon is an old gravel pit, so it's not a very old or nutrient-rich system, and it also has a really small watershed. So it has a lot of good things going for its water quality. Keller Lake. Keller Lake is another shallow water body. This is our other lake that's on the state impaired waters list. Keller Lake received an alum treatment in the spring of 2019, and that led to a really good year for clarity, phosphorus, and chlorophyll in the lake. So we had a a good year where we're meeting the state standards. A lot of that was due to the alum treatment, which I'll talk about in the next slide here. An alum treatment is an aluminum sulfate application. Alum is added to the water column. The alum binds with phosphorus that's available in the water column and also settles to the bottom. And when phosphorus is released from the sediments, it binds that as well and makes it unavailable to algae or plants. And alum is kind of an important step in the lake improvement process. So usually you focus on the watershed reduction projects first. So rain gardens and storm ponds, and making sure that you've done significant work to reduce the amount of phosphorus that's coming in the lake. But because there's a legacy of a lot of phosphorus coming into the lake, you also have to look at how to reduce that phosphorus that's already cycling every year within the lake. And an alum treatment is a good way to do that. So this photo here shows the applicator out there, and then also the semi trucks that would come and refill the tanks for the alum treatment on Keller Lake. This was the first round of treatment, and we're expecting another round of treatment to hopefully further the gains of the alum treatment. And the next application is planned for 2021 or 2022. Then another new project we have going on in Keller Lake is a native plant reintroduction. So we've been working on curly leaf pondweed control for a few years in Keller Lake. Curly leaf pondweed is an invasive plant species that's been basically a monoculture in Keller Lake in past years. It dies off in early summer and can release nutrients that lead to algae blooms. So we've been working on control of curly leaf pondweed. But we've seen a low response from the native plant community. So we're pending our approval of our DNR permit. We're going to be reintroducing some native plant species into the lake from a local nearby source lake. That will hopefully provide us some diversity and some competition against curly leaf pondweed coming back in the future. Then we're also going to be working, hopefully, this is still pending, but we're working with the University of Minnesota on putting together a seed bank study. So they're going to test the lake sediment to determine what plants may still be present in the seed bank but not growing, and that can help inform our work towards trying to restore the lake plant community and the lake health in general. So that's a couple new projects on Keller Lake. Moving on to Crystal Lake. Crystal Lake, as I mentioned, has been improving, and this was another good year for Crystal Lake with all of the parameters within the state standards. So things are looking good out on Crystal. Then another lake that receives runoff directly from Crystal Lake, or the next lake in the chain, is Twin Lakes. There's a Twin Lake South and a Twin Lake North. We monitor the water quality in the South Lake, but they're pretty similar conditions. So Twin Lake is another shallow lake, but it actually has really good conditions for a shallow lake. So we've been easily meeting the state standards out there this year and in past years as well. Then the next water body is Wood Pond. Wood Pond is another relatively shallow water body. And as I mentioned in one of my early slides, it has not been meeting the city goal for clarity, which is more stringent than the state goals, but it has been meeting the state goals for the state clarity or nutrient goals. And we did conduct an alum treatment in Wood Pond in fall of 2018. And so 2019 was the first growing season after that alum treatment. And we had a really positive response from clarity and phosphorus and chlorophyll, where those numbers were well within the state standards this year. And that's a significant improvement from past years. And on the chain of lakes through the Minnesota River watershed is Early Lake. Early Lake is another shallow water body, but water quality conditions are pretty good out there, meeting the phosphorus and chlorophyll and clarity standards. And we have a pretty diverse native plant community out there. Then the last lake or pond on the list is Sunset Pond. Sunset Pond is a shallow water body. Most of it is just a few feet deep. So it's a fairly nutrient-rich system. It has been meeting the state standards. So you can see below the phosphorus, chlorophyll, and clarity goals there. It does have some seasonal issues with filamentous algae blooms. Some years are worse than others, but that's one of the primary concerns out at Sunset Pond is these periodic algae blooms. Then I did want to just hit on aquatic plant diversity in general. So for a lot of folks, aquatic plants can be something that they don't necessarily enjoy as part of their lake or pond experience. And can definitely understand that. But we do like to remind residents that plants are an important part of the natural system of the lake. So they help stabilize sediments. They help compete with algae for resources. So if you have plants, you're likely going to have less algae and less algae blooms than you would otherwise. And then they do provide a refuge for fish and a lot of other ecosystem benefits. So in general, we recommend if you live on a lake that you manage the plants as needed for your enjoyment of the lake and your use of the lake. But it's not necessarily something that is good to kind of wage an all-out battle with and try to eradicate. And the graph here on the right or table shows aquatic plant diversity throughout our system. So we do have a plant survey conducted by a consultant on our lakes most years. Crystal Lake is the most diverse for aquatic plants. That's also one of our healthier lakes in town. So that has 21 different plant species in it. Early Lake is up there with 20 species. Our two impaired waters are Alum Lake and Keller Lake. Those lakes have 8 and 6 plant species present respectively. So there is definitely a tie in the health of a lake system and the quality of a lake system and the aquatic plants and the diversity of aquatic plants. So they are providing a lot of benefits for us. Then I always want to let commissioners and residents in general know that there are ways for them to get involved with improving local water quality. So we have a great workshop opportunity for residents called the Landscaping for Clean Water Workshop. This is run by the Dakota County Soil and Water Conservation District. This year there are virtual workshops, and I believe you can sign up through July to participate in those. And if you participate in the workshops, you'll be eligible to apply for a grant for $250 from the Soil and Water Conservation District. And then the city also has its own grant program separate from the Soil and Water Conservation District, which also will fund water quality improvement projects for up to $1,000. And the projects that are especially focused on for the Landscaping for Clean Water workshops and these grants in general are rain gardens or small garden basins that capture a rooftop or driveway or lawn runoff. And then also shoreline restorations. So if you live on a pond or a lake, restoring a nice native buffer that helps provide habitat and filter runoff water. So those workshops, that's a really great opportunity for residents. And then we also have a storm drain stenciling program where resident groups or individuals can go out, get designated an area by city staff. We have kits that you can put in your wagon or in your car or carry along with you, and paint messages on the storm drains in your neighborhood that remind people that those storm drains drain directly to their local pond or their local lake, and hopefully get the message out there that what happens on your property, whether it's fertilizing or pesticides or whatever it might be, can really have an impact on local water bodies. So that's a program that's out there, and that I think I mentioned we have 6,000 drains, so there's a lot of volunteer opportunity to get involved there. Well, and with that, as I mentioned, this is an informational meeting or presentation, so there's no action items needed, but I'd certainly be happy to answer any questions commissioners or the public may have.
Thank you, Caleb, for the great presentation. I see that there's a couple of questions for Caleb. Commissioner Arnold, I think you had a question, is that right?
I do. Caleb, I was wondering, when you do the alum treatments, did you have a % reduction goal? And did we meet it in the lakes that we did treat?
There was not a specific % reduction goal. So it's not based on, I guess, a goal of reducing clarity by 1 meter. It's more based on an engineering estimate of how much alum treatment is needed or how much alum treatment a lake can hold, basically. So alum can change the pH in a lake. So there's only a certain amount you can safely apply without changing the pH. So basically, we'll add what we can safely apply, and then we can track the changes through clarity in the future, but we don't necessarily set out an exact target goal. But it's pretty well established that there is a very direct impact or improvement after an alum treatment.
Do you also follow the phosphorus concentration for the alum treatment to see how it's working?
Yes. Yep. So we have data collected for phosphorus, nitrogen, chlorophyll A, and then clarity, water clarity.
Okay. And then just one more question on the alum treatment. When you add the alum, does it binds with the phosphorus, correct?
Yep.
And then is it like just bind with that phosphorus that's in the column right then, or as stuff comes through the rest of the summer, will it also grab onto that, or is there a maximum that each molecule will hold, and that's what you base, like you're going to do it in every 2 years, or how does that work?
Yeah, so there is kind of a maximum once all the alum bonds or particles are bound with phosphorus, then it's not going to be effective beyond that. So there is kind of a maximum amount that it can bind. It primarily works, not necessarily to bind phosphorus in the water column when it's applied, though it does do that. But it also works throughout the season at phosphorus that's released from the sediments. Maybe not necessarily the inflow, but within a lake, there's always a lot of breakdown of organic material, and then phosphorus that's kind of released at the sediment level. So the alum helps bind up that phosphorus that's released throughout the season at the sediment level and prevent it from being accessed by algae.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Commissioner Donaldson, did you have a question as well?
Yeah, I did, Caleb. Is there a fairly high cost associated with the alum treatment?
Yes, they are expensive. I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but they are significantly expensive. So it's not something that you'll necessarily do every year. They're more likely to be targeted for a cycle, of every 10 years, something like that. And since they are expensive, that's one of the reasons why they're not done, I guess, haphazardly. You really want to work on managing the watershed inflows of phosphorus first, because if you can slow that down, you're going to get a lot more benefit and longevity out of an alum treatment. So yeah, they are expensive, and that does definitely go into planning how they're used.
All right, thanks for that.
Excellent. Any other questions from any other commissioners? I do have one question myself. You mentioned some of the native plant species that you're reintroducing into a couple of the water areas. You know, there was a pretty big difference between some of our more healthy water features versus some of the more impaired. Is there a threshold that you look at to say that it is likely in a situation where it has a decent amount of species? It seems like the 20 to 21 kind of categories seem significant. I don't know if that also is influenced just by the type of kind of water body that might be. I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, I haven't heard of a threshold specifically. I think 20 to 21 is definitely pretty good shape. I think it seems like 14 or 15 above that, it seems like you have a pretty stable native plant community, and below that, it seems like the community is less stable, more likely to fluctuate between algae blooms and plants from year to year. But it's an area that is understudied, so it's relatively a newer area of study where people are working on restoring lake plant communities. There's been a lot of work done to restore upland habitats like prairies or wetlands, but I think there's just starting to be more focus on working on the in-lake aquatic plant system.
Awesome. It seems like a way that we can help out those water bodies, and also it looks nice too. So it's great. Commissioner Arnold, you had an additional question, it looks like.
Yes, just in talking about the weeds, I was wondering what the state is with Eurasian milfoil in some of the lakes, and if we're going to be doing any treatment for those.
Yes, so most of our water bodies, I'm trying to think through the lakes, I think all of them have Eurasian water milfoil. And so it's pretty widespread through our water system. Most of our lakes are connected through pipes, so that kind of makes sense. And in general, it's relatively under control in most of our water bodies. So we do have a consultant who does surveys, and they did a survey on Crystal Lake this spring and found that the densities were relatively low, so it didn't seem to warrant any treatment. So that's something we kind of track year by year and determine whether potential treatment might be needed.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Any final questions for Caleb? Awesome. Thank you so much, Caleb, for presenting. I think this was an informational only. So with that, we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is a public hearing, a review of Burnsville Stormwater Pollution Prevention Program, the 2019 annual report. And I believe Emily Jennings is our presenter.
Good evening, commissioners. Thank you for having me back again this year to talk on the City of Burnsville's 2019 annual report for their NPDES MS4 permit. As mentioned, I'm Emily Jennings, a water resources engineer with SEH. Just so a quick look at what we're going to be talking about this evening, of a brief overview of the NPDES program. We'll talk a little bit about what the MS4 permit is and why the city has it. We will talk through the compliance of the City of Burnsville's permit for the 2019 year, as well as some 2019 highlights, and then briefly look forward into the future of the MS4 permit. So some background, the NPDES program stands for National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. This is a federal program that was founded as part of the Clean Water Act. As I mentioned, it's federal, so it is under the United States Environmental Protection Agency, but the administration is handled on a local level. Here in the state of Minnesota, that's the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. The city of Burnsville is a phase 2 small MS4, and what that means is that they share general permit coverage with most other MS4s in the state of Minnesota. There's only 2 phase 1s in the state, so Burnsville and a lot of the other neighboring communities have the same requirements. So the MS4 permit itself, MS4 stands for Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System. And what that means is the city owns and operates a storm sewer system to convey stormwater. As part of the MS4 permit, the city is required to have a stormwater pollution prevention plan, or a SWIP. And the SWIP is comprised of minimum control measures and best management practices, or BMPs. There's a lot of acronyms with this whole program. So if I say something in the acronym form and it just doesn't make sense, jot it down and we can talk about it at the end. So like I had mentioned, there are minimum control measures. This is a really the majority of the stormwater pollution prevention plan. And the 6 of them include public education and outreach, public participation and involvement, illicit discharge detection and elimination, construction site runoff control, post-construction runoff control, and pollution and prevention and good housekeeping for municipal operations. So another component of the SWIP is the reporting process, which is a big reason why we are all here this evening. The city is required to submit an annual report each year by June 30th to cover the previous calendar year. So the annual report that the city will be submitting shortly covers January 1 of 2019 to December 31st. If you'd like to view what that annual report will look like, there is a draft copy on the city's website at burnsvilleminnesota.gov/SWPPP. In addition to the annual report, the city is required to do a self-assessment and a review on their program and how they're doing. The city opts to do this side by side with their annual reporting process. And based on the information gathered from the self-assessment as well as the annual report preparation, the city has met its requirements for the 2019 year. It's also important to add that the MPCA does audit MS4s in their programs. They say it happens approximately on a 7-year cycle, subject to change. The city of Burnsville was audited previously in 2016, and that audit report came back that the city was in compliance and their program was working as the permit intends it to. So now we're going to just run through some highlights, 2019 highlights by minimum control measure. So minimum control measure 1, public education and outreach. The city uses a variety of different methods to share information related to stormwater and the city's stormwater pollution prevention plan, including brochures, newsletters, cable TV, presentations, events and trainings, meetings, and the city's website. All these different avenues really help the city to reach a broad audience. And if you'd like any more information on the circulation of any of these different methods, please see that draft annual report. Minimum control measure 2, public participation and involvement. This minimum control measure requires the city to give the public at least one opportunity annually to comment on the city's stormwater pollution prevention plan. And the city receives those comments, they consider them, they will respond, and then if changes are needed to the SWIP, they will go through an amendment process. So I just have included on this slide some past meetings, and then on the far right side in parentheses, the number of comments the city has received. There has been very few in the past few years, which is totally okay. But in addition, this year, there's a slight change in that there's a new comment form on the city's website, which I'll share a little bit more information about towards the end of the presentation, but this is just another opportunity for the public to ask some questions about the stormwater pollution prevention plan. Minimum control measure 3 is illicit discharge detection and elimination. This portion of the MS4 program requires the city to be vigilant in inspecting for illicit discharges, but also be aware in how to detect and eliminate them. So the city is trained in illicit discharge detection and elimination, and they look for illicit discharges during day-to-day operations, including outfall inspections and inspections of priority areas, but they can't always have all eyes on everything. And because of that, there is an illicit discharge hotline that the city also maintains. In the 2019 year, there was one illicit discharge that was reported, and the duty officer was involved. This illicit discharge, although you never want them to occur, this was a great example of how the city is trained and they know what to do. The police were notified by a resident, and the police officer involved 2 city staff members who were able to detect the cause of the illicit discharge and able to prepare the proper documentation, and the illicit discharge was taken care of from that point. So just a good example of how the city knows how to respond to these things. Minimum control measure 4 is construction site stormwater runoff control. So although the city has their own set of requirements that may be more stringent than the MPCA really only wants you to report on projects that meet their thresholds. So for this minimum control measure, we only report on sites that are greater than 1 acre. So in 2019, there were 15 construction projects that were greater than 1 acre within the city of Burnsville. And at those sites, there were 114 inspections that occurred with varied frequency. Frequency depends on a few different things, including the stage of construction and the receiving waters, for example. And from those inspections, there were 32 notices of violation and 33 correction notices. So those numbers might look a little high, but I think that they're reassuring that the inspections are being done thoroughly, and there were no more severe responses needed. So those took care of everything. Minimum control measure 5 is post-construction stormwater management. So again, the MPCA is really only concerned with sites greater than 1 acre. And in 2019, there were 6 potential projects reviewed that met that threshold. They were reviewed to see if they meet the city's requirements, which are at least as stringent as the construction stormwater permit, and they include the requirement to match pre-development runoff rates and volume management as set forth in the minimal impact design standards. Minimum control measure 6 is pollution prevention and good housekeeping. This particular minimum control measure really focuses on the city's infrastructure and inspecting it and maintaining it. And a big part of that is the structural stormwater BMPs, outfalls, and ponds that are part of the MS4 system. There are different frequency that inspections are required of. Structural stormwater BMPs are 100% annually, and outfalls and ponds are required to be inspected within the term of the permit. So it's approximately 20% annually, assuming you have a 5-year permit term. In 2019, 100% of the structural stormwater BMPs were inspected. 124 or 9% of the outfalls were inspected, and 82 or 17% of the stormwater ponds were inspected. So although those outfalls and ponds numbers are slightly below the 20% mark, the numbers have been higher in the past, and as long as you get 100% within that permit term. However, it is important to note that the MPCA has opted to modify that with that frequency with the future permit to set a requirement of 20% annually. So it's just something to keep in mind moving forward that the city is aware of already. So now I'm going to go through some 2019 project highlights. Last year when we had this meeting, we shared the same schematic that you can see on this slide, preparing for a slope stabilization study project. There were 3 different sites that you can see here that had some slopes that were causing some erosion and scour, and it needed some stabilization. So now we can see that that project was completed, so we can come full circle on this. Here you can see the Rupp Drive site before and after. Here is another image of the Rupp Drive site before and after the slope stabilization project. Here we have the church site before and after. Hayes Drive site before and after. Another look at the Hayes Drive site before and after. If you have any other questions about the slope stabilization project, I encourage you to reach out to Jen Desert, city engineer. So now just a brief look forward. You know, I've been mentioning this for a couple of years now, but there is a new permit in the near future. The current MS4 permit that the city is operating under is currently expired, and that is because the MPCA is a little bit behind on reissuing that. Tentatively, we had planned for the new permit to be issued summer of this year. However, I believe there's some delays to that due to the COVID-19 situation. But the new news is potentially in the fall, or maybe sooner. And when that new permit does get issued, the city will be required to complete what's called a Part 2 reauthorization application, which is essentially a very detailed self-assessment and annual report. So the city can determine what they need to do to meet the intent of the new permit. As every time the MPCA issues a new permit, there's always some slight changes, sometimes more than slight. And then following that application, the city will complete program updates to kind of meet the intent of that new permit. There's also talks of potential new permit fees for all water permits through the MPCA. They're really in preliminary discussions of this right now, but currently the city pays a $400 fee every time they apply for the permit, which is once about every 5 years. However, the MPCA is looking at changing that fee cycle to be annually, and it would be population based. There's a pretty large change in the amount of money that the permit fees would cost. And they're really just in the early stages of this right now. And I had mentioned previously that there is a new comment form. So this is a screenshot of the city's website, again, at burnsvilleminnesota.gov/SWPPP. And you can see at the bottom there's a link to a comment form. So if people aren't able to make comments this evening, they can also utilize the website. And with that, Chair Newman, will you please open the meeting for public comment?
Absolutely. So just a point of clarification for myself, should we open for questions from our commission first and then for public comment, or the other way around?
Whatever you would prefer is fine with me.
Okay. So maybe I'll open it up to commission questions, and then we can open it up to the public comment, if that's okay. Any questions from our commission? All right. And Megan, are there any people wishing to comment publicly from the public?
No one from the public has asked to speak, Madam Chair.
All right. And I believe we need a motion on this one. Is that accurate, Emily? A motion to adopt, I'm assuming?
I don't believe so. I think we just needed to have that public comment opportunity.
Okay.
Jen, maybe you can add to that.
I do believe we need, if you have any recommendations for the SWIP, That would be the recommendation. If you have no recommendations, I think we need a motion that you have no recommendations to proceed as we've been going.
Perfect. So with that, maybe I'll open it up to the commissioners. Are there any recommendations we would suggest on this presentation or report out? All right, hearing none, then I'm looking for a motion to proceed with no recommendations. Can I get somebody to motion? Commissioner Donaldson appears to be.
I so
motion.
move.
All right, thank you.
I second.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Alum. And then JJ, can you do a call the roll of votes?
Yes. Commissioner Angara,
Aye.
Commissioner Arnold,
Aye.
Commissioner Bauer,
Aye.
Commissioner Cleveland,
Aye.
Commissioner Donaldson,
Aye.
Commissioner Fitchett,
Aye.
Commissioner McGuire,
Aye.
Commissioner Newman,
Aye.
Commissioner Woolman.
Aye.
Thank you, commissioners. Recommendations, no recommendations passes.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank
And
you.
with that, I believe we're moving on to miscellaneous. The only thing I currently have noted is our next meeting, which is July 6th. JJ, any additional items that we want to cover from staff?
Yes, thank you, Chair Newman. I would just like to point out that this is Commissioner Bauer's last meeting with us. He is a student representative that has served his term, his one-year term with us, and he's moving on. So thank you, Commissioner Bauer, for your one-year of service with our Parks and Natural Resources Commission.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, so with that, I believe we can move to adjourn. Do I have a motion?
I motion to adjourn.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Arnold. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Fidget. All right, so JJ, can we do a call of the roll of votes?
Well, one last time, Commissioner Angara,
Aye.
Commissioner Arnold,
Aye.
Commissioner Bauer,
Aye.
Commissioner Cleveland,
Aye.
Commissioner Donaldson,
Aye.
Commissioner Fitchett,
Aye.
Commissioner McGuire,
Aye.
Commissioner Newman,
Aye.
Commissioner Woolman.
Aye.
Thank you, commissioners. Motion to adjourn the meeting is passed. Thank you.
All right. Have a great night, everyone, and stay safe. This is the end of our Parks and Natural Resources Commission meeting for June 1st. Thank you.